Morning light spilled over the rooftops of St. Clair, a small French village nestled between golden wheat fields and the slow murmur of a river that glowed like liquid glass. The year was 1940, and for 10-year-old Émile Fournier, the world was still an endless summer. He woke each day to the sound of roosters crowing, the smell of bread from Madame Roux's bakery, and the laughter of schoolmates who chased marbles across the cobblestones. His mother's voice, soft and steady, hummed through the kitchen as she stirred milk into coffee, while his father mended shoes near the window, humming the tune of an old marching song that had long since lost its meaning. To Émile, the universe existed in the distance between his doorstep and the riverbank, a stretch of earth where frogs croaked, dragonflies shimmered, and time moved slowly enough for dreams to take root. The war was a rumor, a story whispered by adults when they thought the children were asleep, something far, away and invisible, like thunder beyond the mountains. Every morning, Émile carried a wooden box filled with pebbles he pretended were treasures from distant lands. His imagination made kings from scarecrows, castles from barns, and battles from sticks. He loved to watch the trains pass beyond the hills, long silver serpents trailing smoke across the horizon. Each whistle made him wonder where they were going, what kind of people rode inside, and if the world beyond the village smelled different from home. His best friend, Lucien, was always by his side, daring him to climb the old church wall or jump from the hayloft into piles of straw that felt like clouds. They were explorers in a world still untouched by fire, soldiers of their own make-believe kingdom where laughter was the only weapon. Sometimes, when planes droned faintly above the clouds, Émile would point and say, "Look, Lucien, birds made of iron." And Lucien, pretending to know everything, would nod seriously and reply, "They're flying to heaven." They didn't yet know those same wings would one day turn the sky to ash. That summer smelled of apples and dust, of chalk and rain. The church bells marked time like a heartbeat, echoing across the hills with a rhythm so constant that people stopped hearing it. But beneath that peace, something was shifting. A tremor in the grown-ups' voices, a new silence in the evenings, when the radio whispered headlines that didn't sound like stories anymore. Émile sometimes caught his father staring at the map pinned above the workbench, tracing invisible lines with his finger, lines that didn't belong to his world of rivers and games. One night he asked, "Papa, will the war come here?" His father looked up, forced a smile, and said, "Wars are for men, Émile, not for boys." The boy nodded, comforted by the lie, unaware that somewhere beyond those same fields, engines were already rolling, and the peace he knew was living. Its final days. In that fragile dawn before history struck, St. Clair was still a painting of innocence, and Émile was the small, bright signature in its corner, soon to be smudged by the shadow of war. It began not with an explosion, but with a sound that didn't belong to the valley, a deep, metallic growl that rolled over the hills like thunder out of season. The people of St. Clair paused mid-step, their eyes turning toward the horizon where a thin trail of smoke drifted against the pale morning sky. The birds stopped singing first, then the dogs began to bark. Émile stood barefoot by the river, holding a stick he had carved into a sword, watching the water tremble with each distant rumble. He didn't understand the sound, only that it made his chest tighten. Moments later, the first tanks appeared on the far road, grey beasts grinding through the dust, their treads crushing the wildflowers that grew along the path. The adults shouted for the children to go inside, but curiosity rooted Émile where he stood. He had drawn tanks before, in the margins of his school notebook, but none looked like these. The metal glinted under the sun, indifferent and alive. The air, filled with orders, barked in a language no one in the village spoke. German voices, sharp and rhythmic, echoed off stone walls as soldiers poured into the square. Their boots struck the ground in perfect unison, and for the first time in his life, Émile felt the earth vibrate beneath human footsteps, windows shut like blinking eyes. The smell of smoke and oil replaced the scent of bread. The flags on the town hall were torn down, replaced by one that hung heavy and black against the wind. The men who tried to protest were silenced with a single look down the barrel of a rifle. Emil's father pulled him inside, his hands trembling more from disbelief than fear. Through the slats of the shutters, the boy watched as soldiers stacked sandbags, posted guards, and turned the fountain where he once played into a checkpoint. The war had arrived without warning, without invitation, and it took the village in a single breath. That night, the silence returned, but it was different now, heavier, hollow. The sound of boots echoed even in dreams. The once familiar streets were shadows patrolled by men with guns. Emil lay awake on the floor beside his mother, the candlelight flickering over their faces. He whispered, "Papa, will they leave soon?" His father didn't answer. Outside, a German officer shouted an order, and the slam of a door broke the stillness like a gunshot. The smell of diesel drifted through the cracks of the window. The boy clutched his wooden box of pebbles to his chest, as if holding on to the last piece of his old world. The fields where he had once chased butterflies were now mined and guarded. Even the river, his river, carried strange shapes downstream. Helmets, broken crates, the debris of someone else's battle. In the distance, the church bells tried to ring, but the soldiers silenced them. The music of St. Clair was gone. Only the hum of engines remained, marking the moment childhood ended, not with a cry, but with the cold rhythm of marching feet. Days passed like ghosts through the hollow streets of St. Clair. The village that once smelled of flour and rain now reeked of gasoline, rust, and fear. Emil wandered through alleys where laughter used to live, stepping carefully around the boots and shadows that claimed the corners. The soldiers had made their camp in the schoolyard, their trucks parked where he once played marbles. His teacher's blackboard was now a command map, covered in chalk lines that looked like scars. And yet, beneath the weight of occupation, the boy's curiosity refused to die. He watched the soldiers with the same quiet fascination he once gave to ants, studying their rituals, how they cleaned their rifles, smoked their cigarettes, and stared into the sky as if haunted by invisible ghosts of their own. He didn't see monsters. He saw men lost inside machines. But his father warned him, "Do not look too long, Emil. War stares back." One grey morning, as mist crept over the fields, Emil followed a trail of broken crates and tire marks that led to the outskirts of the village. There, half buried in the mud beside a ditch, he found it, a fallen rifle, its barrel bent, its wood slick with rain and dirt. It looked asleep, not dead. The boy crouched beside it, his breath clouding in the cold air, and touched the metal with the tip of his finger. It was colder than he imagined. Heavy, too. He tried to lift it and nearly fell backward under its weight, but he didn't let go. In that moment, something shifted, not in the world, but in him. The rifle wasn't just an object. It was a question he didn't know how to answer. Who had dropped it? Was he alive? Would he come back for it? Emil didn't know, but he wrapped it in his coat anyway, hiding it like a secret. That night, while his parents whispered about rations and rumors, Emil lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the rifle tucked beneath his bed. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like discovery. Every gust of wind outside felt like fate breathing through the cracks. He imagined the soldiers searching for it, imagined being caught, but also imagined being brave. In his dreams, he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a protector of the village, standing tall on the bridge with the fallen weapon in hand, guarding the people he loved. He didn't yet understand that courage and danger speak the same language, only in different tones. The invisible call had been answered, not by a soldier, but by a child who mistook duty for destiny. The rain came 2 days later, steady and endless, turning St. Clair into a mirror of puddles and reflections. The soldiers moved slower now, their grey uniforms darkened by water, their helmets dripping like cold metal rain. Emile watched them from behind a stable wall, his small body pressed against the wood, heart beating faster with every passing step of the patrol. He had hidden the rifle beneath a loose floorboard in the barn, wrapped in burlap and tied with a strip torn from his blanket. It wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a living thing that pulsed beneath the floor, calling to him through the silence. That morning, he decided to see it again. He lifted the board, hands trembling, and there it was, dull, wet, imperfect, yet magnificent in his young eyes. He brushed the mud from its barrel with the sleeve of his shirt, the way a child might clean a wounded animal. Outside, the rain had softened into mist, and Emile could hear the distant growl of an engine. A German convoy had stopped near the bridge where villagers were being ordered to unload crates. His father was among them, his back bent beneath the weight of wood and fear. Emile wanted to run to him, but his mother's voice echoed in his head, "Stay hidden, promise me." He stayed, but when one of the crates slipped and broke, scattering papers into the water, the soldiers began shouting. They shoved his father, their words sharp, unintelligible. Something inside Emile snapped, a child's fury that didn't understand its own power. He grabbed the rifle, stumbling toward the barn door, his small fingers trying to hold what his body wasn't built to bear. The metal was heavier than any burden he'd ever known. He didn't plan to use it, he only wanted to show he could protect. Yet as he stepped outside, the patrol turned, eyes, rifles, silence. The world froze. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. The sound of rain hitting helmets was louder than breath. A 10-year-old boy stood in the mud, holding a weapon almost as long as he was tall. The Germans hesitated, not out of mercy, but confusion. One soldier lowered his rifle, whispering something that sounded like disbelief. Another laughed nervously. Emile's arms shook, the barrel pointed nowhere, his chest rising and falling like a trapped bird's. Then, slowly, his father's voice broke through the haze. "Emile, drop it!" The shout cracked the spell. The boy blinked, startled, and the rifle slipped from his hands, hitting the ground with a hollow thud. No gunfire followed, no punishment came. Only silence, deep, stunned, eternal, before the soldiers turned away, muttering, as if the moment had embarrassed even them. The war had paused just for seconds, for a child who didn't know he had stopped it. The mud swallowed the rifle again, but something far greater had already been unearthed. The fragile power of innocence in a world made of steel. The following morning, the village awoke in strange quiet. The soldiers had moved on toward the next town, leaving behind torn posters, burned crates, and a silence that no bird dared disturb. The people of St. Clair emerged from their houses like survivors of a long dream, blinking at the light as though they'd forgotten what daylight looked like. Emile sat by the riverbank again, his bare feet tracing circles in the mud where he had once built castles of sand. The rifle was gone, taken by the soldiers after the standoff, yet its absence felt heavier than its weight. He could still feel the cold metal against his palms, the echo of that impossible moment when the world seemed to hold its breath because of him. But to the adults, it was a miracle survived, not a victory earned. His father never spoke of it again, and his mother's eyes, once soft, now carried a permanent shadow when they looked at him, pride and fear woven together. The days that followed unfolded like a silent film. Fields smoldered where wheat once shimmered, and smoke hung over the horizon like a second sky. Emile began collecting fragments, a brass button, a piece of broken glass, a torn patch from a soldier's uniform. He placed them in his wooden box, where marbles and feathers once lived. Each item told a story he could not yet understand. When he walked through the ruins of the schoolhouse, the blackboard was still covered in arithmetic, the words smeared by soot and rain. 2 + 2, he whispered, tracing the chalk lines with a trembling finger, as if solving the equation might bring the past back. Through the shattered windows, he saw the village, rebuilding itself in small, fragile gestures. A woman sweeping rubble, a man hammering a door back onto its hinges, children whispering songs instead of singing them. But the innocence that once bound them all had scattered like ashes in the wind. One afternoon, as the sun sank behind the fields, Emile followed the path toward the old church. Its steeple was cracked, the bells fallen, the pews buried in dust. He sat where the altar once stood, watching the light filter through a broken stained glass window. The colors painted his face, red, blue, gold, the same hues that once belonged to saints and angels. But to him they looked like the pieces of a story too big to tell. He whispered to the empty air, "Did I stop the war, or did it just forget me?" The wind offered no answer, only the creak of the roof, the slow flutter of a torn flag, and the faint echo of laughter that lived only in memory. War to a child was not blood or bodies, it was the sound of absence, the missing bell, the missing friend, the missing tomorrow. The seasons shifted without ceremony. Autumn crept into St. Clair carrying the smell of damp earth and iron. The leaves fell quietly, covering the scars of war like nature's attempt at mercy. Yet even the beauty of the changing fields couldn't soften what lingered in Emile's eyes. He no longer ran toward the river or chased the echo of trains. His world had become smaller, confined to the house, the workshop, the muted tones of survival. His father rarely spoke now, moving through each day as if conversation were a luxury he could no longer afford. At night, Emile would hear him step outside, striking matches to smoke in silence, watching the hills as though waiting for something, someone, to return. His mother mended clothes by the glow of a single candle, her hands steady, her expression carved from quiet endurance. The war had not taken their lives, but it had stolen their music. One afternoon, Emile wandered toward the edge of town, where the fields turned to forest. There, near a collapsed fence, he found Lucien's cap, the same one his friend had worn the day they played soldiers before the invasion. It was torn and half buried, the initials LF still visible beneath the mud. He froze, staring at it as the wind swept through the tall grass. No one had seen Lucien since the shelling weeks earlier. Some said his family fled south. Others whispered darker things. Emile picked up the cap, brushed it off and pressed it to his chest. In that simple act, the last trace of his childhood dissolved. He felt a heaviness he couldn't name, grief, guilt, and the strange, cold knowledge that some games never end. He didn't cry. The tears had learned to hide somewhere deeper now, in the quiet places children shouldn't have to build inside themselves. That night, rain fell hard against the roof. Emile sat by the window, the cap beside him, watching. Lightning flashed over the hills. For a moment, each strike revealed the broken outlines of the village, houses patched with tarps, the church still leaning like an exhausted soldier, and the dark line of the forest beyond. Somewhere in that darkness, the sound of distant artillery rolled like thunder, faint but endless. He whispered Lucien's name once, softly, as if the night itself might carry it home. The world outside didn't answer. Only the wind moved, carrying the scent of wet, soil, and something faintly metallic. In that moment, Emile understood what his father had meant when he said war never truly leaves. It only hides in the sound between heartbeats. The boy turned away from the window, the cap still in his hands, and closed his eyes. Childhood, for him, was no longer a season. It was a memory buried beneath the rain. It was near the end of winter when Emil first saw him, a wounded soldier lying beneath an oak tree at the edge of the forest, half buried in snow. The boy had gone searching for firewood when he noticed the shape, at first mistaking it for a fallen deer, but as he approached, the figure moved, groaning softly, a pale face turning toward him. The man's uniform was torn, his leg bandaged with a strip of cloth darkened by blood. He was not German. The insignia on his sleeve marked him as Allied, a pilot perhaps, or a scout. His lips were cracked, his eyes hollow from pain. Yet, when he saw the boy, he managed a faint smile. "Bonjour," he whispered, his accent rough but kind. Emil froze, heart pounding, the cold air burning his lungs. For a moment, the entire forest seemed to hold still, waiting to see what the child would do. He didn't run. Instead, he knelt beside the man, his small hands clumsy as he brushed snow from the soldier's coat. "You need help," he murmured, though he knew no help could come. Bringing anyone from the village would risk discovery. Still, something in the man's eyes, that fragile brightness, that quiet plea, anchored Emil in place. He fetched water from a nearby stream, tearing a piece from his own scarf to clean the wound. The soldier thanked him softly, his voice thin as thread. "You're brave," he said, "braver than most men." The words struck something deep within the boy, something that warmed him against the cold. He returned every day after that, bringing scraps of bread, bits of fruit, anything he could steal without notice. They spoke. Little, but their silence carried more than words. The soldier told him once, between fever dreams, that courage wasn't the same as strength. "Courage," he said, "is when you're afraid, and still stay." As the days passed, the forest became their secret world. Snow melted into soft earth, birds returned, and the man began to heal. He taught Emil to fold paper into shapes, birds, stars, tiny airplanes that they tossed into the air, watching them drift like prayers. Sometimes the boy would ask questions about the war, and the soldier would answer with tired eyes. "It will end," he'd say, "but people like you're the reason it must." Those words sank into Emil's heart like seeds waiting for spring. For the first time since the occupation began, the world no longer felt entirely cruel. Beneath that tree, between a boy who had lost everything and a man who had seen too much, hope quietly rebuilt itself, fragile, human, and alive. The thaw of spring came, with whispers of retreat. German patrols were fewer now, their voices tense, their movements rushed. The air smelled of smoke and endings. Emil had continued to visit the soldier, whose name he had learned was Thomas, a pilot shot down weeks earlier, hidden by the mercy of chance and a boy's courage. But one morning, Thomas's expression changed. He was sitting up, pale but determined, clutching a folded paper map that trembled in his hands. "Emil," he said softly, "you must take this to the old mill, to the men there. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, though he barely did. The map, Thomas explained, marked the German supply routes across the region. If it reached the resistance, it could save dozens of lives. "I can't move anymore," Thomas whispered. "They'll find me, but you—" He looked at the child as one might look at a miracle. "They'll never suspect you." The world seemed to narrow to that single moment. The wind through the trees, the weight of the map in his pocket, the quiet thump of his heart beneath his coat. Emil knew fear intimately by then, its shape, its taste. But this was something different. It was purpose. He left before dawn, crossing the fields alone, the rifle-shaped absence of his past replaced by a folded secret pressed to his chest. The road to the mill, cut through a burned orchard, past the ruins of homes and the skeletons of wagons. Smoke curled in the distance where the German convoy had passed. He walked quietly, each step deliberate, rehearsing Thomas's words in his mind like a prayer. But near the edge of the village, he saw them. Two soldiers, their silhouettes dark against the morning fog. He froze, his breath shallow, the world shrinking to the sound of boots crunching gravel. He could hear their laughter, casual, human. Then one of them turned, time shattered. The soldier shouted, rifle raised, and Emil's instinct took over. He ran, through mud, through smoke, through the tangle of fences and debris. The map clutched like salvation. Bullets snapped through branches behind him, sparks leaping off stone. He stumbled once, fell into the dirt, and when he looked up, he saw the old mill ahead, its broken sails towering like the bones of a forgotten giant. He pushed himself forward, lungs burning, the shouts fading into distance. As he reached the doorway, a man stepped out, rough clothes, a red scarf tied at his neck, eyes wide with recognition. Mon Dieu, the man breathed, pulling the boy inside. Emile handed him the map without a word. For a long moment no one spoke. Then the man knelt, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. You did it. Outside, the wind howled through the valley. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the front went silent, not by orders, but by awe. A 10-year-old child had carried courage through the fire, and for a few seconds, even war remembered its humanity. When the shouting stopped, Emile didn't realize it at first. The now world had been a blur of footsteps, gunfire, and breathless running, and now, suddenly, there was only quiet. The men of the resistance had vanished into the woods with the map, their silhouettes swallowed by fog. The boy stood alone beside the old mill, his clothes torn, his hands trembling, his small frame outlined against the pale morning light. Somewhere in the distance, a single engine coughed, sputtered, and then died. What remained was the soft hum of the wind and the faint rustle of leaves, as if the earth itself were exhaling after holding its breath too long. Emile looked around, waiting for something, an explosion, a voice, a sign, but nothing came. Just silence, deep, endless, merciful silence. He didn't know it yet, but in that brief pause, hundreds of lives had been spared. The convoy had turned, the attack had faltered, and for the first time in months, the valley knew peace, however temporary, however fragile. The boy sank to his knees, staring at the dirt between his fingers. He could smell the burnt air, feel the heat of fear still pulsing through his chest. Somewhere far off, a church bell tried to ring again, its tone cracked and weary, but real. The sound made his throat tighten. He remembered Lucien, his father, his mother, all the faces that had faded behind the smoke. For the first time since the invasion, Emile allowed himself to cry. Not the quick, hidden tears of a frightened child, but the deep, shaking, kind that empty the soul. His sobs mingled with the wind, until the forest seemed to mourn with him. When the tears finally stopped, he sat still, listening. Even the birds had returned, tentative and uncertain, testing the air as if afraid to believe it was safe. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, stood, and began walking home, every step lighter, as though he carried something invisible, not the weight of war, but the echo of survival. By the time Emile reached the village, the sun had broken through the mist. People were emerging from their houses again, blinking at the light, whispering to each other in disbelief. A rumor spread faster than the wind that the Germans were retreating, that the Allies were near, that Saint-Clair might live again. But no one knew about the boy or the map or the silence he had carried into being. He slipped through the streets unseen, his boots leaving small prints in the damp earth. When he reached his home, his mother rushed to him, gathering him into her arms without a word. He pressed his face into her shoulder, breathing in the scent of bread and smoke. In that moment, the war felt far away, like a dream that had burned itself out. Outside, the sky turned gold, the fields shimmered, and the wind whispered across the plains of France, gentle, eternal, and free. For one fleeting heartbeat, even history bowed its head. The war ended not with a roar, but with a slow unraveling of noise. The clatter of engines fading into distance, the echoes of boots dissolving into soil. Liberation came to St. Clair weeks later, not as a parade, but as a procession of exhausted men in olive uniforms and jeeps splattered with mud. The villagers gathered in silence, too stunned to cheer, their joy tangled with disbelief. Flags that had been hidden in cellars re-emerged, colors bright against the grey ruins. Emile watched from the steps of the church, the same church that had once stood broken and mute. Now a new bell rang, not perfectly tuned but whole. The soldiers smiled, handed out rations, and left behind chocolate bars that children unwrapped like sacred offerings. For Emile, it was strange to see kindness in uniform again. The men looked human, tired, sunburned, alive. They asked him his name, and when he answered, one of them placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You made it, kid." The words didn't feel like praise. They felt like permission to exist again. Beyond the village, France itself lay scattered in fragments. Roads cratered, bridges twisted, towns flattened to dust. Entire landscapes had been rearranged by steel and fire. And yet, amidst the destruction, life persisted, stubborn, green, miraculous. Farmers ploughed the fields beside the skeletons of tanks. Children skipped stones across rivers that once carried wreckage. Women rebuilt schools with their bare hands, painting walls over bullet holes, turning scars into colors. The war, they realized, had not only redrawn borders on maps but within hearts. The enemy was no longer a man in a helmet, but the silence that follows hate. In that silence, people began to remember who they were before the world tore itself apart. Emile wandered through it all, observing with a quiet wonder. He saw things that adults couldn't, the way weeds bloomed in shell craters, the way sunlight touched even the blackened walls, as if forgiving them. History books would later call it reconstruction, but to those who lived it, it was resurrection. Letters found their way home, names reappeared on lists, and stories began to surface. Stories like Emile's, whispered in corners, passed between soldiers and priests, between mothers and sons. They called him the boy who stopped the front, though he never confirmed or denied it. He was too young to explain what had really happened, too old to forget. To him, the war was not a tale of glory, but of sound. The hum of silence after the last shot, the heartbeat of a world relearning how to breathe. And so, as St. Clair rebuilt itself stone by stone, the child who once carried a fallen rifle carried something far heavier, the memory of a moment when time itself paused, as if waiting to see whether humanity would survive. Decades later, the world no longer smelled of smoke and metal. The roads to St. Clair were paved, the fields greener than Emile ever remembered. The river still curved, gently through the valley, but now its banks were lined with benches and wildflowers planted by hands that had never known war. The village was alive again, louder, brighter, filled with laughter that didn't have to hide behind closed doors. And among its quiet streets, an old man walked slowly, a cane in his hand, the weight of years in his steps. His hair was white now, his eyes still the same grey-blue as the morning mist. It was Emile Fournier, no longer the boy who had carried a rifle, but the man who had carried its silence. He lived in a small house near the edge of town, where the church bell's echo reached him each dawn, reminding him that peace, too, had its own rhythm. On the 50th anniversary of the liberation, the town unveiled a small museum, a single room inside the rebuilt schoolhouse. Children ran ahead of their parents, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. Inside, glass cases displayed rusted helmets, old maps, letters browned by time. And in the center, under a soft light, lay a relic, a bent rifle wrapped in cloth, its wood scarred and darkened by age. The plaque beneath it read, "The weapon that ended a moment of war, carried by a child of St. Clair, 1944. Emile stood before it, motionless, his reflection merged with the glass, the boy and the man coexisting for a fleeting second. His granddaughter tugged at his sleeve. "Was it you, Grandpapa?" she asked, eyes wide. He smiled faintly, his voice low and even. "No, my dear," he said. "It was a boy who believed the world could stop fighting, and for a moment it listened." That evening, as the village gathered for the memorial, the church bells rang again, their sound rolling across the fields like a tide of memory. Emile sat beneath the same oak tree where he once found the wounded soldier, watching the sky turn amber. Time had folded itself into a quiet loop, the laughter of children blending with the ghosts of the past, the scent of bread and spring returning to a place that had once known only ash. He closed his eyes and could still hear it. The silence, that impossible stillness that fell when he was 10 years old and lifted a weapon he didn't understand. But now, it no longer haunted him. It comforted him. Because in that silence he realized there had been something more powerful than fear. The proof that even in the darkest moment humanity had paused long enough to remember itself. The museum lights, dimmed one by one, leaving only the faint glow around the glass case. Outside, night spread quietly across the fields, the same fields that once burned under war and now shimmered beneath a silver moon. Emile lingered by the doorway, cane in hand, watching as the last visitors left. The silence returned, not the kind born of fear, but the kind that follows understanding. He stepped closer to the display, his reflection fading into the darkness. The rifle rested there like a memory, fossilized in time, a relic of a boy's mistake that had become a nation's story. Around it were photographs, faded faces of soldiers, villagers, and children. Each one had carried a fragment of that same silence, each one changed by it. Emile touched the glass lightly, his fingers trembling. He whispered to the weapon not as an enemy, but as an old companion. "You made me see." He walked home slowly through the cobblestone streets where the lamps glowed warm and steady, their light soft against the stone. The world had grown old, gentler, but its scars still whispered beneath the paint. He thought of the men he had never met again, Thomas, the pilot, Lucien, his lost friend, his parents, who never spoke of the war after it ended. History had scattered them like ash, yet somehow their stories still reached this night. Every sound around him, the hum of crickets, the rustle of wind through wheat, was proof that the earth had chosen to forgive. He sat on his porch, the stars stretching above like 1,000 unspoken prayers. For a long while he simply listened, the same way he had listened as a child when the world went silent for the first time. When dawn came, it brought the smell of bread again. Warm, simple, familiar. The sun rose over St. Clair, gilding the rooftops in gold. The war had ended more than 70 years ago, but its echoes still lived in stories told by those who refused to forget. Emile's chair creaked as he leaned back, his eyes half closed. In that stillness, a single truth came to him, quiet, absolute, eternal. He had not stopped the war. He had reminded it what mercy sounded like. He smiled, his breath soft against the morning air. The narrator's voice faded in. He was too young to fight, but old enough to teach the world what courage means.